The lights went out first.
Stay back
Then the
or she
screaming
dies.
started.
Big mistake.
Daniel Reyes
Get off
stood
me.
very still
It's
in
over.
the dark.
Don't move.
One
Oh my
hand
God, you
already
saved
closed
me.
around the
Whoa,
neck of a
that was
wine
incredible.
bottle he hadn't meant to pick up. Somewhere to his left, Isabel Cross was calling his name, and underneath the panic in her voice was something worse: recognition. She knew who had let them in. He didn't answer her. He was listening to footsteps, 4 sets, moving in a pattern he had drilled into recruits a lifetime ago. His son was 3 miles away, asleep, safe. That was the only fact that mattered right now. Everything else was math. 6 hours earlier, Theo's socks didn't match, and Daniel had noticed this fact roughly 4 times in the last hour, and decided each time that it wasn't worth the fight. The Fernway Coffee House sat 2 blocks off Pike Place, the kind of place with exposed brick and a chalkboard menu that used words like single origin and charged $7 for a cortado. Daniel had picked it because it was close to Theo's speech therapy appointment, not because it was close to anything resembling his budget. He sat near the window in a canvas jacket with a coffee stain shaped like Ohio on the left sleeve, watching his 5-year-old son attempt to stack 4 sugar packets into a tower that kept collapsing. "One more try, buddy," Daniel said, sliding the packets back into a neat pile. "Base first, big ones on the bottom." Theo frowned at the tower with the deep, personal offense only a 5-year-old can summon for inanimate objects. He didn't speak, Theo rarely did, not since the accident that took his mother 18 months ago, not since the words had started getting stuck somewhere between his mind and his mouth, but he pointed at the packets, then at Daniel, then made a small circular motion with his hand. "Help. Together." "Yeah," Daniel said quietly. "Together." He built the base. Theo placed the top packet with the solemn concentration of a surgeon. It didn't fall. Theo's mouth curved, not quite a smile, but close enough that Daniel felt something in his chest unclench a fraction, the way it always did on the rare mornings that went easy. That was when the laughter started, 3 tables over. "Oh my God, Preston, look at this." The voice belonged to a woman in a cream blazer, her hair so precisely blonde it looked engineered. Is he wearing that jacket to a job interview? Or did he lose a bet? Preston, tall, aggressively tan, wearing a quarter zip that cost more than Daniel's truck payment, didn't bother lowering his voice either. Bro can't even keep his kid quiet. Is he broken or something? Kid hasn't said a word since they sat down. Daniel felt the old, familiar tightening along his jaw. He didn't look over. He reached out and steadied Theo's tower with 2 fingers, the way he'd once steadied a rifle on a ledge in Kandahar province. Breath even, hands still. "Must be exhausting," the woman said, not quite to Preston, not quite to the room, pitched exactly loud enough to be overheard. "Some people just shouldn't have kids if they can't afford to look put together in public." Theo's small hand found Daniel's sleeve and gripped it. He'd heard the tone, if not the words. Kids always did. "Hey, buddy," Daniel murmured, low enough that it was only for Theo. "You're doing great. Ignore them." He meant it, mostly. 3 years out, and the part of him that used to answer insults with something considerably worse than words had been folded up small and put away in a box he didn't open anymore. He'd made a promise about that box, standing at a graveside in the rain, and he intended to keep it. 3 tables past the mocking couple, in the corner booth with the best sightline to both exits, a habit Daniel had clocked without meaning to, the way he clocked everything, sat a woman working through a stack of documents with the kind of focus that made the rest of the cafe disappear around her. She wore a charcoal blazer, sleeves pushed to the elbow, a slim laptop angled so the screen faced the wall. Isabel Cross had been the CEO of CrossVantage Bio for 6 years, had taken the company from a converted garage lab to a gene therapy pipeline worth $11 billion, and she had learned, in that time, to read a room the way other people read a headline. She'd clocked Daniel within the first 30 seconds of sitting down. Not because he was handsome, though he was, in a battered kind of way, because he was wrong for the room in a way that had nothing to do with his jacket. He sat facing the door. Both exits, actually, she'd watched his eyes flick to the side entrance near the pastry case twice in the last 10 minutes, an unconscious check the kind of thing a person did without deciding to. When the espresso machine let out a sharp hiss of steam, his shoulders had tightened for exactly half a second before releasing. Most people didn't react to that sound at all. A person who did, and recovered that fast, had been trained to. And when the blonde woman's voice cut across the cafe, Isabel had watched Daniel's face for a reaction and found none. No flush of anger, no tightening around the eyes, just a man quietly stabilizing a sugar packet tower for his son, breathing exactly the way he'd been breathing 30 seconds earlier. "Who are you?" she thought, and went back to her spreadsheets, mostly. Her phone buzzed against the table. A text from Marcus, her chief operating officer, currently 3 floors up in the Cross Vantage building 2 blocks away, prepping the final numbers for tonight's investor call. Marcus, board's asking why you're not in the building. The Tannis merger vote is in 4 hours. Isabel, I need 20 minutes of quiet before I have to perform enthusiasm for men who don't understand the science. I'll be there. Marcus, understood. For your information, building security flagged an unfamiliar vehicle in the north garage. Probably nothing. Handling it. She frowned faintly at the message, then set the phone face down and returned to the merger documents. Probably nothing was a phrase Marcus used a lot lately. He'd seemed distracted for weeks, sharper with the junior staff, later to arrive, quicker to end calls. She'd chalked it up to merger stress. Everyone was frayed thin this quarter. At the mocking couple's table, Preston had pulled out his phone. I should film this. Deadbeat dad ruins brunch, caption it, put it on TikTok. He angled the camera toward Daniel and Theo without asking. The casual cruelty of someone who had never once in his life been told no in a way that stuck. Daniel still didn't look over, but something in the set of his shoulders shifted, not anger, something quieter and more final, like a door closing somewhere deep in a building. Careful, Bug, he said to Theo, sliding the boy's milk cup a half-inch further from the table's edge. Old habit. Control what you can control. That was when the black van jumped the curb outside. It hit the sidewalk hard enough to crush a metal trash bin, tires screaming, and came to a stop directly across both of Fernway's front windows. To the rest of the cafe, it registered as nothing more than a jarring noise, a reckless driver, a delivery gone wrong, the kind of thing that happened in cities. Daniel's brain processed it differently and completely. No plates, front or rear. His eyes tracked the vehicle's stance, low and heavy on its suspension, in a way that had nothing to do with factory specs. Armor plating, aftermarket. The windows carried a tint too thick and too even to be legal glass, the particular dull sheen of ballistic-rated polycarbonate. The part of him that had been folded up and put away for 3 years opened its eyes. Theo. His voice had changed, not louder, but flattened, stripped of warmth, every word doing exactly one job. We're playing the quiet game, right now. Theo, who had never once in his life heard his father sound like this, went very still. Daniel didn't stand. He scooped his son off the chair in one motion, staying low, and moved not toward the door, not toward the panic building at the front tables, but sideways, fast and silent, toward the service counter. He put Theo down behind the heavy wooden counter, wedged between a rack of ceramic mugs and the wall, and knelt so they were eye to eye. Don't move. Don't make a sound. Watch the wall. His hand rested against the boy's chest for exactly 1 second, a heartbeat check, an old reflex, and then he was gone. At the corner booth, Isabel had risen halfway out of her seat, laptop forgotten, watching the van's side panel slide open with a heavy mechanical clunk. 4 men stepped onto the sidewalk in tailored black tactical jackets, faces covered, moving in a tight diamond formation that told her everything she needed to know about what this was and nothing at all about who had sent them. Preston's phone was still up, recording, his mocking smirk frozen into something closer to confusion. Is this a bit? Is someone filming a movie? The lead man kicked the reinforced glass door hard enough to tear the magnetic lock from its frame. It swung open and slammed against the wall. 4 suppressed weapons came up in near unison. Nobody moves. The accent was thick, unplaceable, the voice pitched to fill the whole cafe. Everybody down. Now. The room detonated into screaming. Preston dropped his phone and dove behind the leather sofa so fast he nearly climbed over his own girlfriend to get there. The barista behind the counter froze mid-pour, coffee overflowing across the wood in a slow brown tide. Isabel stood alone in the open, 6 feet from her booth, 6 feet from nowhere to hide. 2 of the 4 men broke formation and moved straight for her, weapons raised, tunnel-visioned on the one target that mattered. Target confirmed. Move on my mark. Behind the counter, crouched low in the shadow of the espresso machine, Daniel Reyes felt his pulse do something it hadn't done in 3 years. It didn't spike. It slowed, dropped from a tired 68 beats per minute into a cold, deliberate 52, the way it used to before a breach, before a door came down, before the part of him that Sarah had married, and the part of him that the Marine Corps had built, stopped being 2 separate men and became briefly one. He looked down at his hand. He was still holding the ceramic sugar tower plate he'd grabbed off the table without thinking. If they take her, they kill the witnesses. The thought arrived whole, clinical, already 3 moves ahead. They kill Preston. They kill the girl at the register. Eventually they find the boy behind the counter. Daniel Reyes exhaled once, slow and even. The tired father went quiet. Something else woke up in his place. The first mercenary never saw it coming. Daniel came off the floor low and fast, closing 8 feet of open café in under a second. The ceramic plate held flat against his palm like something he'd trained with for years instead of a prop he'd grabbed off a coffee table 40 seconds earlier. He drove it forward with his whole shoulder behind it, catching the trailing gunman across the temple with the flat edge. The man's knees buckled before he even registered pain, and he went down in a loose, boneless heap that told Daniel everything about how clean the hit had been. The second man spun, weapon swinging up, mouth already open to shout a warning that never made it out. Daniel stepped inside the arc of the barrel, the one place a rifle couldn't reach him, and slapped it wide with his left hand while his right drove up and in, a short, brutal strike to the throat. The man's suppressed weapon clattered against the hardwood as both his hands flew to his collapsing windpipe, and Daniel took the weapon out of the air before it hit the ground. The whole motion so fluid, it looked almost gentle, almost rehearsed for an audience. It had taken 4 seconds. Behind the leather sofa, Preston had stopped filming. His phone lay forgotten on the floor, screen cracked, still recording the ceiling, and was staring instead with his mouth hanging open, the mockery from 20 minutes ago curdling into something that had no name yet. Beside him, the barista, 17 years old and still holding a portafilter like a shield, had gone very still, eyes locked on the man she'd assumed was a tired, broke, invisible customer. From the corner booth, Isabel Cross watched Daniel Reyes move through 2 trained gunmen, the way a man might move through an obstacle course he'd run 1,000 times before, and felt the specific, dropping vertigo of watching a fact rearrange itself in real time. The 2 remaining men at the front, the ones who hadn't broken for her, spun toward the sound of their teammates going down. "Contact!" the lead shouted, weapon swinging toward the counter. Daniel was already moving, the stolen suppressed weapon coming up to his shoulder, his thumb finding the selector switch by feel alone. He dropped to one knee behind an overturned cafe table, making himself small, and fired twice, controlled, economical, the recoil barely registering against his shoulder. The lead man took both rounds center mass and folded straight down. The 4th man broke. He didn't return fire. He turned and ran for the shattered door, and Daniel let 2 rounds catch him in the back of the leg on the way out, dropping him screaming onto the sidewalk in a tangle of limbs. Outside, the van's engine roared. Tires shrieked against pavement, and the vehicle tore away from the curb, abandoning its crew in a cloud of white smoke. Silence dropped over the cafe like a wet blanket, broken only by the wet, gurgling breathing of the man with the crushed throat, and somewhere far off, the first rising note of a siren. Daniel lowered the weapon and came up out of his crouch slowly, scanning the room with the flat, methodical sweep of a man checking corners out of habit rather than fear. His eyes moved past Preston, past the barista, past the wreckage of the front tables, and found Isabel Cross standing exactly where she'd frozen, one hand braced against her booth. He didn't ask if she was hurt. He gave her a short, clinical nod. "You're clear," and then his whole posture changed, the ice draining out of him so fast it was almost violent to watch. He set the weapon down on an overturned chair, out of reach, out of sightline, and moved toward the service counter at something close to a run. Theo. The boy was exactly where he'd been left, wedged into the corner behind the mug rack, knees pulled to his chest, eyes wide but dry. He hadn't cried. He hadn't made a sound at all, which was, Daniel understood distantly, both a mercy and its own kind of small tragedy. "I'm here, Bug." Daniel dropped to his knees and pulled his son into his chest, one hand cradling the back of his head, and felt the boy's heartbeat hammering fast and light against his own ribs. "I'm here. It's over. The game's over." Theo didn't speak. He never did, not out loud. Not since the crash on 405 that had taken Sarah and left something broken and quiet in her son that 18 months of speech therapy hadn't fully repaired. But his small hand found the collar of Daniel's jacket and gripped it hard enough to whiten his knuckles, and that, Daniel had learned, was its own kind of sentence. Isabel crossed the room slowly, stepping around the wreckage, and stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak quietly. Up close, she could see the milk stain from that morning's spilled cup, a story Daniel would never get the chance to tell her now, dotted with a fine spray of someone else's blood. "You're former military," she said. It wasn't a question. Daniel didn't look up from Theo's hair. "I'm a dad who works construction. You just took apart 4 professionals with a plate and a stolen weapon in under a minute." Her voice was steady, but underneath it, Daniel could hear the adrenaline still shaking loose. "Construction workers don't do that." "Ma'am, Isabel." Isabel. He finally looked up at her, and she saw, for the first time, the exact shade of exhaustion behind his eyes. Not the tired of a man who'd had a bad morning, but the tired of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had just been reminded how heavy it actually was. "I need to get my son somewhere that isn't a crime scene. Fast." Sirens were close now, close enough to rattle the front windows. Isabel glanced toward the street, then back at Daniel, and made a decision the way she made all her decisions instantly and completely. "Then let my people handle the police," she said. "You leave now. You're a fleeing suspect on every camera in this cafe. You stay, and by the time Seattle PD walks through that door, my legal team will already have explained exactly what happened here. Your son will not see the inside of an interview room. You have my word." Daniel searched her face for the calculation he expected to find there, the angle, the leverage, the what's in it for you, and found instead something closer to simple exhaustion and simple gratitude, worn thin and honest. "Okay," he said finally. The next 4 hours passed in a blur of lawyers Daniel didn't remember hiring, forms he didn't remember signing, and a black SUV that ferried him and Theo, wrapped in someone's borrowed coat, to a glass-walled conference room on the 31st floor of the Cross Vantage Bio building. Theo had fallen asleep on a leather sofa in the corner within 20 minutes, worn out past the point of fear, one small fist still curled around a stress ball an assistant had produced from somewhere. Isabel sat across a long table from Daniel, a tablet in front of her, the city's gray evening light pooling against the windows behind her. She'd changed out of her stained blazer into a spare shirt someone had found. She looked, Daniel thought, like a woman who had learned a long time ago how to keep functioning through catastrophe and hated that she'd had the practice. Daniel Reyes. She read from the tablet without quite looking at it, the way a person recites something they've already memorized. Force Reconnaissance, 1st Marine Division, 2 deployments, honorable discharge, 3 years ago. She set the tablet down. The public record stops there. Everything after that has your name on a redacted personnel file that took my head of security a call to a retired general just to confirm existed. You had 4 hours and you found that? I have very good people and a great deal of money. She folded her hands. Your wife. Daniel's jaw tightened, just slightly. Sarah. I'm sorry. The file said car accident. 18 months ago. Isabel's voice gentled. Just fractionally, not performance, Daniel thought, but genuine, And that surprised him more than the money had. And your son doesn't speak. He speaks, Daniel said, quiet but immediate, just not with his mouth most days. The doctors call it selective mutism, trauma-related. It'll come back. It's coming back. He said the last part like a man repeating something he needed to still be true. Isabel nodded slowly and let the silence sit for a moment before she continued, because some things deserved a beat of respect before you moved past them. The men who came into that cafe today, she said finally, were not random. My company is 3 weeks from finalizing a merger that would make CrossVantage the largest gene therapy pipeline on the West Coast. There are competitors who would prefer that didn't happen. Today was a message. If it had gone differently, it would have been the beginning of something much worse. You think they'll try again? I know they will. She leaned forward. I have a private security team. They're competent, ex-law enforcement, good at crowd control and building perimeters. None of them could have done what you did in that cafe. I watched you process 4 armed men and neutralize all of them with a stolen weapon and a piece of dinnerware in under 60 seconds, Daniel. That isn't security. That's a different category of person entirely. I left that category behind. Did you leave it, or did it just stop paying rent? Her tone wasn't cruel, but it landed with the precision of someone who had negotiated with far tougher men than him and knew exactly where the soft tissue was. You're doing day labor construction work. You live in a 2-bedroom walk-up in Rainier Valley, with a 5-year-old who watched his father go from stacking sugar packets to putting men on the ground, and I'd guess from the look on his face back there that it wasn't the first time he's seen you go somewhere he couldn't follow. Daniel didn't answer. His hand had gone still against the table, and something in his face had closed, quiet and total, the way it had in the cafe before the first strike. I'm not offering you charity, Isabel said. I'm offering you a job, head of my personal security, full authority, full autonomy from my current team, $240,000 a year, medical for you and your son, and because I suspect it matters more than the salary, the kind of stability where you're not choosing between a shift and his speech therapy appointment. I don't want your money because I bled for it. You didn't bleed for it. You'll be paid for the skill, not the violence. She held his gaze. The violence already happened, Daniel. It happened 3 years before you ever walked into my company. All I'm asking is that you stop pretending it isn't still in you, and let it be useful instead of just exhausting. Daniel looked over at the sofa, at Theo's small chest rising and falling in sleep, one thumb near his mouth out of a habit he was supposedly too old for. He thought about the apartment that flooded every March when the drainage backed up. He thought about the look on Theo's face this morning, wide-eyed and silent, watching his father go somewhere Theo couldn't follow him. 3 conditions, Daniel said finally. Isabel's mouth curved, just slightly. Name them. I run my own detail. Your current head of security reports to me operationally, not the other way around. Done. If whoever sent those men comes again, we don't wait for them to make the first move a second time. Agreed. A beat. And the third? Theo comes first. Every time. If a job conflicts with him, the job loses. Isabel didn't hesitate. That's not a condition, Mr. Reyes. That's the only kind of person I'd trust with this. 2 floors down, in an office with the blinds drawn against the evening light, Marcus Webb sat very still at his desk, staring at a message on a burner phone he kept in the bottom drawer, the one his wife didn't know existed. Unknown. The cafe was a mistake. Don't let it happen again. We need what you promised us by Thursday, or your family finds out what a margin call really looks like. Marcus's hand was not quite steady as he typed his reply. Marcus, I need more time. Security's tightening. If I push now, she'll know it came from inside. Unknown. You don't have more time. You have a mortgage and a daughter starting at Lakeside next fall, Thursday. He deleted the thread, the way he did every time, and sat for a long moment with his forehead resting against his palms. Through the wall, he could hear the murmur of voices in the conference room, Isabel's, and a second voice he didn't recognize, low and even, the voice of a man who sounded, even through drywall, like someone who didn't waste words. Marcus straightened his tie, wiped his face with both hands, and opened his laptop. Buried 3 folders deep in the merger documentation, disguised as a routine access log audit, was a small file transfer he'd initiated. 11 minutes earlier, a piece of the building's security schematics, routed to an address that didn't exist on any server CrossVantage owned. He hit send before he could think better of it, and told himself, the way he told himself every time now, that this was the last one. 3 weeks passed the way weeks do when a person is rebuilding a life out of spare parts. Daniel moved himself and Theo into a 2-bedroom unit in a secured building, 4 blocks from CrossVantage headquarters, modest by Isabel's standards, the nicest place Daniel had ever lived by his own. He spent his days running perimeter assessments, rebuilding the company's protective detail from the ground up, and interviewing security contractors with the flat, unhurried scrutiny of a man who had once decided, in under a second, which 4 strangers deserved to live and which order to drop them in. He spent his evenings, without fail, at Theo's kitchen table, building towers out of whatever was on hand blocks. Now, instead of sugar packets and listening for the small sounds his son was starting, cautiously, to make again. A hum. A single syllable. Once, unprompted, the word more, directed at a stack of pancakes, and Daniel had gone into the bathroom afterward and sat on the edge of the tub for 4 minutes before he trusted his own face again. He liked Isabel Cross more than he'd expected to. She worked like someone trying to outrun a debt only she could see, and she never once, in 3 weeks, asked him a question about his service record again. She let the silence around it stand, which he found he respected more than curiosity would have earned. He did not, in 3 weeks, warm even slightly to Marcus Webb. It wasn't anything Daniel could point to directly, no missed meeting, no obvious lie. It was smaller than that. The half-second delay before Marcus answered certain questions, the way his eyes tracked toward the door during security briefings, the fact that he'd twice rescheduled one-on-ones with Daniel's team at the last possible minute. Daniel had spent a career reading the space between what people said and what their bodies did while they said it, and Marcus Webb's body was telling a story his mouth wasn't. He mentioned it to Isabel exactly once, over coffee in her office, phrased as carefully as he knew how. Your COO. How long have you known him? 11 years. He was employee 4. He mortgaged his own house to make payroll the month before our Series A closed. She said it like an old, settled fact, the kind that didn't invite relitigation. Why? No reason yet, Daniel said, and left it there, because no reason yet was the most honest sentence he had, and because 11 years of loyalty was not nothing, and because he had been wrong about people before, and had learned, expensively, not to move on a feeling alone. He kept watching anyway. The invitation for the Helix Series launch gala arrived on cream cardstock, the kind of paper that announced its own price before you'd even read the words on it. CrossVantage Bio was unveiling its flagship gene therapy platform to 300 investors, journalists, and biotech executives at the Pacific Science Center, beneath the arches, with the Space Needle lit gold in the window behind the stage. It was, Isabel had told him flatly, the most important night of the company's decade, the night the Tannis merger would either be secured or lost, and it was happening in 11 days. In a public venue, Daniel's team had exactly that long to lock down from scratch. I don't love it, Daniel said, standing over a table covered in floor plans, 3 of his new hires flanking him. Glass ceiling 40 feet up, 6 public entrances, and a guest list that includes half the tech press in Seattle. That's not a security perimeter. That's a stage with lighting. It's also non-negotiable, Isabel said from the doorway, arms crossed. Every investor who matters will be under that roof. We cancel, we look like we're hiding something, and Tannis walks. Then we don't cancel. We control what we can control. Daniel tapped the floor plan. I want eyes on every entrance, plain clothes on the catering staff, and full sweep of the building 48 hours out, not 4. And I want to personally vet the AV and security systems vendor list. Marcus, seated at the end of the table reviewing budget lines, didn't look up from his tablet. That's going to blow the event's budget by 6 figures. Then it blows the budget by 6 figures, Isabel said, without hesitation, and something in Marcus's jaw tightened at that small, quick gone before anyone but Daniel would have caught it. Interesting, Daniel thought, and said nothing. Preston Kane had spent 3 weeks trying very hard not to think about the cafe. It wasn't working. He'd deleted the cracked screen video off his phone the same night. Some instinct telling him that footage of himself diving behind a leather sofa while a man he'd mocked 20 minutes earlier dismantled 4 gunmen was not content he wanted circulating. But the memory itself had proven harder to erase than the file. He kept replaying the moment before the van hit the curb, his own voice, loud and pleased with itself, asking if the guy across the cafe was broken or something. He kept seeing Daniel's face, calm and unbothered, steadying a sugar tower for his silent kid while Preston filmed him for a laugh. So when his girlfriend's cousin, who worked in CrossVantage's marketing department, offered them both +1s to the Helix launch gala free open bar, Preston, it's a big deal, everyone, who's anyone, will be there. He'd said yes before he fully processed why his stomach had dropped at the words CrossVantage. He recognized Daniel the moment he walked into the Pacific Science Center's main hall 11 days later, standing near the west entrance in a black suit that fit like it had been made for him, an earpiece just visible beneath dark hair, scanning the crowd with the same unbothered focus he'd had over a coffee cup 3 weeks earlier. Preston's mouth went dry. He didn't approach. He told himself it was because it would be awkward, and knew, somewhere under that, it was because he was ashamed, and didn't yet have a way to say so that wouldn't sound like it was really about him. The gala moved through its first hour exactly the way galas do: champagne, string quartet, a keynote from Isabel that landed each beat of investor-friendly optimism with the polish of someone who'd rehearsed it 40 times. Daniel worked the room's perimeter with the low, unhurried attention of a man doing a job he was extremely good at, checking sight lines, watching hands, cataloging every unfamiliar face against the guest manifest his team had built. Marcus Webb worked the room too, glad-handing investors, laughing at jokes a half-beat too late, checking his watch with a frequency that had, in the last 20 minutes, gone from occasional to constant. "David, talk to me," Daniel murmured into his lapel mic, using the call sign his lead had picked for himself years ago and never let go of. What's Webb's calendar look like tonight? Nothing on it. Why? He's checked his watch 11 times in 20 minutes, and he hasn't touched his drink once. Daniel's eyes tracked Marcus as the COO drifted toward the building's east service corridor, away from the crowd, phone already halfway out of his jacket. Run a check on his recent traffic. Anything routed outside our normal vendor list. On it. 5 minutes later, David's voice came back tight and low. "Arthur Daniel, you're going to want to see this. There's a file transfer from Webb's credentials 2 weeks ago, building security schematics, sent to an external address that traces to a shell registered out of Rotterdam." Daniel's pulse didn't spike. It dropped, the old cold settling into his chest the way it always did right before something broke open. Isabel needs to know, now, quietly. He found her near the stage, mid-conversation with 2 men from the tennis board, and caught her eye with a look he'd developed specifically for moments like this, no words needed, just enough weight behind it that she excused herself within 30 seconds. "Tell me," she said, once they were 3 steps clear of the nearest guest. "Marcus sent your building schematics to an offshore address 2 weeks ago. I don't have the why yet. I have the what." Isabel's face didn't move, but Daniel watched something behind her eyes recalibrate an entire decade of trust in real time, fast and brutal and silent. "You're certain David is?" "I trust David." "Then find him, quietly. I want him in a room before he knows we." The lights went out. Not a flicker, not a brownout. Every light in the Pacific Science Center's main hall died at once, plunging 300 people into a darkness so total it took the crowd a full 2 seconds to understand it wasn't part of the show, and then the screaming started, and underneath the screaming, from somewhere above them, came the unmistakable sound of glass beginning to crack along the seam of the 40-foot skylight Daniel had flagged as a liability 11 days earlier. and been told, 6 figures over budget be damned, there wasn't time to fully secure. Daniel's hand found Isabel's arm in the dark and pulled her behind the nearest support column without a word. Above them, in the blackness, 6 shapes began descending on ropes through the shattering glass. And through his earpiece, cutting through the chaos, came a voice Daniel recognized immediately, Marcus Webb's voice, no longer glad-handing, no longer checking his watch, speaking low and fast into a phone he'd never bothered to hide well enough. "They're in position. Cut the west corridor cameras. She's yours the second they're down." Daniel went very still in the dark, one hand still braced against Isabel's arm, and understood, with total and icy clarity, exactly who had unlocked the door. The emergency lighting kicked in 8 seconds after the main power died, a dim red wash along the floor moldings, just enough to turn 300 panicking people into a field of shifting silhouettes instead of total blindness. Daniel used those 8 seconds better than anyone else in the room. "David, corridor cameras are down. Webb cut them himself. He's compromised. I say again, Webb is compromised." Daniel's voice into the lapel mic was flat, fast, stripped of everything but information. 6 hostiles descending through the skylight. "Lock every exterior door. Let no one out until my mark. We don't want them scattering into the crowd as guests. Copy moving." Isabel was pressed against the column beside him, breathing hard, one hand fisted in the fabric of his jacket sleeve, without seeming to know she'd grabbed it. "Marcus." "Lauter." Daniel's eyes were already not local, not improvised. The same clean tactical discipline as the Café crew, sharpened. "Stay behind this column. Do not move unless I move you." "Where are you going?" "To buy us 30 seconds. He was already gone, moving low through the panicking crowd, cutting between overturned cocktail tables and abandoned champagne flutes with the same terrible fluid economy he'd used 3 weeks earlier in a coffee shop that felt, now, like a different lifetime. His earlier team, 4 of the plainclothes catering staff he'd personally vetted, hired, and quietly armed under white serving jackets, were already moving into position at his signal, dropping trays, drawing compact weapons from beneath, serving carts exactly as drilled. The first of the descending team hit the ground and unclipped his line, rifle already swinging up toward the stage where Isabel had been standing minutes earlier. Daniel closed the distance before the man's boots had fully settled, grabbing the barrel and forcing it skyward as it discharged into the shattered glass above, then drove his elbow into the man's jaw, hard enough to fold him sideways into a catering cart. 2 more hit the floor in quick succession, moving toward the west corridor toward the door Marcus had promised them was unlocked. Daniel's makeshift team intercepted both before they'd cleared 10 feet, dropping them fast and clean. The remaining 3, scattered wide, professional enough to recognize an ambush, had swallowed their entry and adjust. One raised his weapon toward the fleeing crowd near the east doors, a threat meant to buy panic and cover, not a real intent to fire into 300 civilians. Daniel judged in the half-second he had to judge it, and he closed on the man anyway, because half-seconds were sometimes wrong, and he wasn't willing to bet Theo's father on the difference. He took the man down with a leg sweep and a controlled strike that ended the fight before it started, then turned in time to catch the second-to-last hostile lining up on him directly, weapon raised, close enough that Daniel could see the man's eyes narrow behind his mask, in recognition the Café. This is the one from the Café, a half-second of hesitation that cost him everything. Daniel closed the gap, took the barrel wide with his left hand, and put him down with the same throat strike that had ended a man's fight 3 weeks earlier in front of a very different audience. 1 left. He'd broken for the service corridor. The one Marcus had promised was clear. It wasn't. David and 2 of Isabel's original security team were waiting exactly where Daniel had staged them, and the last hostile went down in a short, ugly exchange of gunfire that put a round through David's vest and knocked him flat, but left him breathing, cursing, and very much alive. Emergency power flooded back into the hall 30 seconds later, full lights this time, harsh and unforgiving, illuminating 300 stunned guests, 6 unconscious or restrained mercenaries, and a scattering of overturned tables that looked, in the sudden brightness, like the aftermath of something much larger than 90 seconds of controlled violence. Daniel found Marcus Webb exactly where the tracking on his phone signal placed him, not fleeing, not fighting, just standing frozen in the mouth of the west corridor with his burner phone still in his hand, staring at the wreckage of a plan that had just failed catastrophically in front of his own eyes. Marcus. Marcus flinched at his name, turned, and found Daniel walking toward him with the unhurried, absolute calm of a man who had already finished the fight and was simply cleaning up what remained. "Daniel, I was trying to find Isabel." I heard the "Don't." The word came out quiet and it landed harder than shouting would have. "I heard you on the line. She's yours the second they're down. You cut the cameras yourself." Marcus's face went through several things very fast. Denial, calculation, and then, finally, something that collapsed inward entirely. The last structural beam of a lie giving out. He didn't run. There was nowhere to run to. And some exhausted part of him seemed almost relieved. The pretending was over. "You don't understand what they have on me," he said, voice cracking. 8 months ago, I put everything, the house, Ellen's retirement account, everything into an internal drug trial I was sure was going to work. I believed in it more than the actual research team did. It failed. Phase 2, complete failure, and I was already leveraged against a fund I didn't fully understand until it was too late. He laughed, short and humorless. "Turns out the fund was a shell for a competitor circling Isabel's merger. They didn't want my money back. They wanted access, building schematics, security gaps, a window. And when the cafe didn't work, they said next time wouldn't be a warning." Marcus's hands were shaking now, badly. "They have people watching my house, Daniel. My daughter starts at Lakeside in September. They said if I didn't deliver the gala." He stopped, and something in his face cracked open fully, years of careful composure giving way all at once. "I told myself it was just information. I told myself Isabel would be fine, that security would handle it, that I wasn't really—" He couldn't finish the sentence because there wasn't a version of its ending that was true. Isabel had come up behind Daniel without either of them noticing, flanked by David. Her face pale, but composed in the particular way of someone holding herself together through sheer force of will. She'd heard enough of it, the trial, the shell fund, the threats against his daughter, to understand the shape of the 11 years she'd trusted him with, and the shape of what he'd done to her anyway. 11 years, Marcus," she said, and her voice wasn't loud, but it filled the space the way grief does. "You mortgaged your house for my Series A. You sat in this exact building and told me you'd never let anything happen to this company." She shook her head slowly. "You could have come to me. About the trial money, about the fund, about any of it, at any point in the last 8 months, and I would have found a way through it with you. Instead, you let armed men walk into a public building full of my employees." "I know." Marcus's voice had gone very small. "I know that now. I knew it the moment the lights went off, and I couldn't make myself feel anything but sick." 2 of David's team moved in to restrain him. He didn't resist. As they walked him past Daniel, he stopped for just a moment, looking at the man who 3 weeks ago had been an anonymous stranger in a coffee shop and was now the only reason his plan hadn't ended in a body count. "For what it's worth," Marcus said quietly, "I hope your son gets his voice back." Daniel didn't answer him. There wasn't anything to say that would land the way it needed to, and some silences were their own kind of sentence. Across the ruined ballroom, near an overturned cocktail table, Preston Kane stood frozen, having watched the entire 90 seconds unfold from behind a pillar he'd barely made it to. In time, watched Daniel Reyes move through 6 armed men with the same unbothered calm he'd had over a coffee cup weeks. Earlier, watched a company's second-in-command unravel in real time. Watched a night meant to showcase gene therapy become something out of a different kind of story entirely. He thought about the video still sitting, unposted, in his phone's trash folder. Deadbeat Dad ruins brunch. He felt something that wasn't quite shame yet, but was closing in on it fast. The Pacific Science Center reopened to the public 9 days later. The skylight repaired, the ballroom quietly recarpeted where the worst of it had happened. Cross-Vantage Bio's stock dipped for exactly one news cycle and then climbed past its previous value once the Tanis board, impressed rather than deterred by how cleanly the crisis had been contained, voted to finalize the merger anyway. Marcus Webb did not go to prison for as long as the initial charges suggested he might. Isabel's lawyers, at her direct instruction, worked with prosecutors to weigh the difference between a man who had built something real for 11 years before one catastrophic year of desperation broke him, and the fund that had engineered that desperation in the first place. He took a plea, testified against the shell operation that had blackmailed him, and would spend the better part of 4 years in a minimum security facility outside Tacoma. Isabel visited him once, 3 months in, and told no one what was said. She quietly ensured Ellen and their daughter kept their health coverage through it. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. It was something more complicated, and Daniel, who watched her decide it, didn't ask her to explain it further, because he understood something about complicated better than most. Preston Kane sent Daniel a message 4 days after the gala, not a text, an actual handwritten letter delivered to the Cross-Vantage building because he didn't have Daniel's address and didn't feel he'd earned the right to ask for it. It didn't try to excuse anything. It said, in essence, that he'd spent 3 weeks thinking a stranger in a coffee shop was someone to laugh at, and one night watching that same man save his life, and that the gap between those two facts was going to sit with him for a long time. He didn't ask for anything in return. Daniel read it twice, folded it into his jacket pocket, and didn't reply not out of cruelty, but because some apologies don't need an answer to be received. Daniel found him anyway 3 weeks later back at Fernway Coffee House, of all places Preston sitting alone near the window, staring at a cortado he wasn't drinking. Daniel didn't sit down. He just stopped by the table long enough to say, "I got your letter," and when Preston looked up, startled, added, "My son likes the sugar packets here. If you're around Tuesday mornings, don't be weird about it. That's all I'm asking. It wasn't friendship. It was smaller than that." And more honest, a door left slightly open instead of slammed shut, which was, Daniel had learned, usually the more useful thing to offer someone who was genuinely trying to be better. On a quiet Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after the gala, Daniel sat across from Theo at that same window table, the light coming in soft and gray off Puget Sound, both of them working through a tower of sugar packets with the same solemn concentration as always. "Base first," Daniel said. "Big ones on the bottom." Theo placed the base packets, then paused, looking up at his father with the particular focus he got right before he was about to try something hard. "Together," Theo said. It wasn't much. One word, quiet, a little unsteady in the middle where the therapy hadn't quite smoothed it out yet. But it was his voice, out loud, unprompted, in the same cafe where 6 weeks earlier he'd watched his father disappear somewhere unreachable and come back changed. Daniel didn't make a scene of it. He didn't want Theo to feel the weight of how much that single word had cost to arrive, or how much it meant now that it had. He just reached out and steadied the tower with 2 fingers, the way he always did, and said, "Yeah, bug, together," and let the moment be exactly as small and exactly as enormous as it actually was. Across the cafe, at the corner booth with the good sight line to both exits, a habit that had never quite left him, and probably never would, Daniel caught himself checking the door out of reflex, the way he still did every morning without deciding to. It was quieter now, that reflex, less like a wound and more like a callus. He'd stopped fighting it 3 weeks ago, around the time he'd stopped waking at 3 a.m., running through the 90 seconds at the gala on a loop, and started, instead, sleeping through most nights the way a person does when the thing they were bracing for has already happened and been survived. He wasn't the man from the cafe 6 weeks ago, the one folding himself smaller to fit into a room that had already decided what he was. He wasn't fully the man from the ballroom either, all cold math and closing doors. He was something between those 2 men now, built out of both of them on purpose, and for the first time in 3 years, that felt less like a burden he was carrying and more like a life he'd actually chosen. Theo placed the final sugar packet on top of the tower. It held. He looked up at his father, and this time, the smile wasn't almost, it was whole. "I keep coming back to that letter Preston wrote, not because it fixed anything, but because he didn't ask it to. He just wanted Daniel to know the gap he'd seen in himself. Most people who've mocked someone never get shown that gap so clearly, and most who do see it never write the letter at all. Have you ever caught yourself laughing at someone before you actually knew what you were looking at? If this one stuck with you, I'd genuinely like to hear about that moment. The one where you found out you were wrong about someone and what you did after.